Hi, everyone. Welcome to you all. So my name is Lucas Rickert. I'm the George Erdung Chair in the History of Pharmacy in the UW School of Pharmacy. I'm also the Historical Director of the American Institute for the History of Pharmacy. As you'd expect, there's a little bit of housekeeping to do. This meeting is being recorded and it's going to be available for others in the future. So bear that in mind, please. We would ask you that you keep your audio muted as well as you possibly can. Also, during the Q&A, you can use the chat feature to ask a question or raise your hand, and you'll be then asked to unmute yourself. So this talk and others in the Psychedelic Speaker Series would not be possible without valuable support and valuable partners. So first of all, I want to thank the UW Transdisciplinary Center for Research in Psychoactive Substances, which was established just last year. Its mission is to support research and educational activities regarding psychedelic drugs and related compounds. Secondly, I'd like to thank the Robert F. and Jean E. Holtz Center for Science and Technology Studies. Their mission is to promote broad interdisciplinary understandings of science, technology, and medicine as human enterprises. Lastly, I want to thank the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy, and its mission is to advance knowledge and understanding of the history of pharmacy and the history of medicines. So with that, let me introduce our wonderful guest speaker, Andrea Ens. She's a doctoral candidate in Purdue University's History Department. Her primary interests involve the history of medicine, the history of sexuality, and psychopharmacology in the 20th century, not only in the United States, but also in Canada. Andrea completed her MA in history at the University of Saskatchewan in 2019, go Huskies, and she advanced a thesis examining the subjective experiences of 12 same-gender attracted men who received LSD therapy on the basis of their sexual orientation at a private clinic called Hollywood Hospital between 1955 and 1973. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing Andrea speak. And thanks again for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Rickert, for your awesome introduction. And thank you to the organizers of this amazing speaker series about tripping into the psychedelics humanities. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen here in a second. All right, can everybody see my screen okay? Can everybody hear me? We're good? Excellent. So without further ado, let's dive on in. From the end of World War II to the early 1970s, various North American scientists, cultural commentators, and laymen expressed concerns regarding psychedelics' possible relationships to shifting gender and sexual norms. Some, like American college psychiatrist Preston K. Munter, feared psychedelics might trigger unwanted same-gender desires in young heterosexual consumers. These drugs, he warned, allowed college students and other youth to rationalize homosexual encounters on the grounds of a wider experience of life, a more vivid aesthetic experience, or a consciousness-expanding encounter. Other psychedelic practitioners in this period stressed their supposed potential to strengthen or even create heterosexual desire. This is exemplified by Timothy Leary's claim that LSD is a specific cure for homosexuality in a 1966 interview with Playboy magazine. Leary went on in this interview to cite examples of men and women who had supposedly discovered their attraction to other genders through LSD, such as American poet Allen Ginsberg and an unnamed lesbian woman who took LSD, saw a man in a bathing suit, and discovered sexual interest in men. These statements, though Leary never used this language at the time, allude to psychedelics as historical applications in conversion therapy. The term conversion therapy refers to a wide variety of medicalized practices attempting to eliminate same-gender sexual desires or change subjects' gender identities from transgender to cisgender. They have more often resulted in reduced self-esteem, self-harm, and/or suicide than in lasting change to gender identities or sexual attraction. Conversion therapies are now illegal in many parts of the world and have since been denounced by several major professional health organizations as harmful, unethical, and ineffective. But conversion therapies were considered an acceptable part of mainstream psychiatric practice in post-war Canada and the United States, including within psychedelic research circles during this period. My presentation today thus outlines Canadian and American practitioners' use of LSD, mescaline, and peyote in psychedelic conversion therapies from the 1950s to the early 1970s. We'll begin by examining the historical context behind psychedelic conversion therapy during these years. I'll then explore various instances of this practice in Canada and the United States within this historical period. This history reminds us of psychedelics' potential both for healing and for harm, depending on therapeutic intent. And it also encourages us to critically consider how social prejudice and power relationships have informed the field over time. It might seem strange to hear that psychedelics, a class of drugs we often associate with mid-20th century sexual liberation, were also used to try and cure same-gender attraction during the same historical period. So why did American and Canadian psychedelic practitioners begin offering conversion therapy in the mid-20th century? Several social, medical, and political factors influenced their thinking. The first was Cold War era anti-communist hysteria. After enduring 2 world wars and the Great Depression, many Americans and Canadians expressed anxiety about shifting gender roles resulting from World War II. Their concerns about sexual chaos were only heightened as the country became embroiled in an ideological conflict that threatened to escalate into yet another war. Though the Red Scare is popularly associated with American McCarthyism, post-war Canadian governments also cooperated with American anti-communist efforts. This allowed fears of the Red Menace to filter north across the US-Canada border, albeit in less vitriolic terms. The shared threat of communist takeover gave heterosexual, patriarchal nuclear families new social meanings in both countries. Men were considered the builders and defenders of their capitalist nations who economically provided for their families, while women were largely supposed to care for children, maintain the home, and support the consumer economy. This social framework left same-gender attraction outside of popular considerations of normal life and sexuality. The resulting anti-gay social discourses fostered a lavender scare alongside and even before the Red Scare, directed towards same-gender attracted Americans and Canadians. The American Lavender Scare resulted in mass civil service, military, and postal service firings, tightened immigration regulations, more restrictive professional licensing procedures to exclude homosexuals from doctoring, dentistry, and teaching, and increased sodomy law enforcement. Workplace purges, police harassment, and immigration law changes also occurred in the Canadian Lavender Scare, justified by criminal code statutes against homosexuality until 1969, and aided by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's Specialized A3 Unit, a group tasked with identifying, blackmailing, and removing homosexuals from the Canadian Civil Service. This legal and social discrimination caused tremendous and often invisible suffering for gay men and lesbians in post-war North America, who were increasingly associated with communism, social sabotage, criminality, atheism, and psychopathy. Foundational changes in North American psychiatry also supported psychedelic conversion therapy's development. The first I'll note is the rising prominence of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis enjoyed a golden age in North American psychiatry from the 1940s to the 1980s, aided by the broader psychiatric discipline's rise to medical and cultural prominence during and after World War II. Most psychoanalysts at this time agreed that childhood trauma or over-reliance on an opposite-sex parent could prevent young children from achieving normal, healthy heterosexuality later in life. Sigmund Freud, for instance, argued homosexuality was not a permanent, stable sexual identity, but a normal temporary phase of childhood sexual development. However, homosexuality might appear in adulthood when children fail to overcome the Oedipal conflict, a stage of childhood development wherein boys around the age of 4 develop temporary incestuous desires for their mothers and reject their fathers. This failure supposedly results in sexual aversion towards women, and its reverse, the Electra complex, occurs in young girls at about the age of 4. Later psychoanalysts built on this theoretical model in ways that further pathologized same-gender attraction. While Irving Bieber's group argued that same-gender attraction developed among young boys with domineering mothers and weak or absent fathers, Sandra Rado, in contrast, claimed homosexuality was a maladaptive behavior resulting from overprotective parents who went too far in prohibiting their children from engaging in heterosexual activity. This supposedly prompted children to escape into homosexual behavior. The popularity of psychoanalysis during this period informed homosexuality's appearances as a formal diagnosis in the first and second editions of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. While the DSM-1 classified homosexuality as a type of sexual deviation and sociopathic personality disturbance, its successor removed homosexuality from the sociopath category, but continued to define it as a type of sexual deviance and personality disorder. But some caveats are in order here before we assume psychoanalysis was wholly responsible for post-war conversion therapy. Psychoanalysts did not have a monopoly on post-war conversion therapy practices, and nor were they the only medical practitioners who believed same-gender attraction was pathological. To name one example, American biological psychologist Robert Galbraith Heath also attempted to cure a male patient's homosexuality in 1970, not through psychoanalytic models, but through electrical stimulations delivered directly to the brain. We must also remember that not all psychiatric practitioners in post-war North America agreed with the pathologization of same-gender attraction. Groundbreaking studies like Alfred Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Evelyn Hooker's The Adjustment of the Overt Male Homosexual questioned the idea that homosexuals were abnormal or sick. Further, as Dr. Rickert has observed in his book, Break On Through, members of the parallel anti-psychiatry and radical psychiatry movements expressed intense anger towards homosexuality's inclusion in the DSM in the late 1960s and early 1970s, culminating in the Radical Caucus's disruptions of annual American Psychiatric Association meetings in 1969 and 1970. Psychedelic conversion therapies thus took place in a therapeutic context characterized by messy debates over whether homosexuality was a healthy, normal variation of human behavior or a diagnosable illness leading to criminal actions, though the overwhelming popularity of psychoanalysis in this period ultimately helped legitimate anti-gay social narratives in post-war North American society and psychiatric practice. Psychedelic conversion therapy practitioners also worked at a time when psychopharmaceutical optimism was at its peak. The emergence of new blockbuster drugs like Thorazine and Miltown in the 1950s sparked hope that previously incurable conditions could be treated through chemical intervention. In this promising atmosphere, Canadian and American psychedelic experimenters in the 1950s to 1970s began considering LSD, mescaline, and peyote's applications in treating alcoholism, understanding schizophrenia as a mind control tool, or even as a cure for same-gender attraction. This was despite the fact that homosexuality was largely understood in psychoanalytic terms as a form of psychosexual immaturity, not a form of neurological chemical imbalance necessarily amenable to drug treatments. So what did post-war psychedelic conversion therapies actually entail? There's no one simple answer to this question because each practitioner's therapeutic process was highly variable and dependent on several factors. In many ways, it's easier to talk about their differences rather than their similarities. The first variable we'll talk about is the set and setting of psychedelic conversion therapy. Many psychedelic conversion therapy practitioners, especially those in Canada, operated within formal clinical settings with institutional support. One example is the forensic clinic at the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital, which, under the guidance of psychiatrist J.R. Ball, administered LSD to cure, quote, 1 transsexualist, 1 transvestist, 5 male homosexuals, and 1 female homosexual of sexual deviance, according to a 1961 report. Another Canadian institution using psychedelics in a similar manner was Hollywood Hospital, a private for-profit addictions treatment facility in New Westminster, British Columbia, that was widely known for its elite clientele and its controversial use of LSD and mescaline to treat drug addiction and alcoholism between 1955 and 1973. But its practitioners also accepted patients for psychedelic therapy without either of these afflictions, including 12 men hoping to be cured of or at least better understand their same-gender attraction. One such individual was an 18-year-old clerk typist I call James Chaka. This isn't his real name. When James laid down on the large, comfortable couch in Hollywood's psychedelic therapy room in October 1967, he desperately hoped this experience would eliminate his sexual attraction to other men. James longed for a normal life, which he hoped would include marriage to a woman and fatherhood. The young man was also horrified by his homosexual desires, convinced he was crazy, ugly, and hated by God. Hollywood staff were unsure whether psychedelics would help James after conducting pre-treatment interviews and screening procedures, but felt the young man had nothing to lose. They thus started him on a psychedelic treatment program consisting of 4 guided experiences over a 10-week hospitalized period. He was administered 200 micrograms of LSD with 400 micrograms of mescaline in the first 2 sessions, and half as much of each compound in his remaining therapies. During his 4 11 to 12-hour sessions, James shared painful, deeply held fears of his own same-gender attraction with Hollywood hospital practitioners. Each also involved lengthy conversations with Hollywood staff about manhood and personal responsibility, again stemming from this idea that homosexuality was a form of psychosexual immaturity. James's clinical experience differed strongly from the more eclectic approaches of other North American practitioners like Richard ALPERT. ALPERT, who later gained countercultural fame under the name Ram Dass, conducted LSD conversion therapy with an unnamed bisexual man in 1969, after the patient wrote ALPERT a letter begging him for help eliminating his same-gender sexual desires. The letter writer explained that he had participated in thousands of homosexual experiences since the age of 15, but had recently become disturbed by this pattern of behavior, writing that he was primarily an overt acting out homosexual and that he did not want to be anymore. ALPERT agreed to the man's request and began a therapeutic program of 4 guided psychedelic experiences over several months. Where ALPERT departed from more clinical psychedelic practitioners was in his efforts to forge connections between Western psychedelic experimentation and Eastern traditions and mysticism. His 1969 conversion therapies drew heavily from his 1964 book, The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This manual, which ALPERT co-authored with Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner, offered information and recommendations on how to prepare for and conduct psychedelic sessions, drawing heavily from Tibetan and Indian philosophies. Drawing from the book's set and setting recommendations, ALPERT described his same-gender attracted patient's first of 4 LSD sessions as occurring within a quiet, relaxing place with soft music, which would allow the patient to, quote, relax and go with the hallucination without much direction other than a few short pre-arranged readings of basically Taoist nature. Further, in formulating his 3rd psychedelic session, ALPERT was inspired by Omar V. Garrison's 1964 book, Tantra, the Yoga of Sex, a text claiming to provide readers with the training and discipline to prepare for satisfying male-female sexual unions according to the Indian Tantra Yoga tradition. ALPERT asked his patient to bring a woman who he was close with and who was also attracted to him to his psychedelic session. ALPERT then instructed her to hold the patient if he desired, and she was also asked to return for his 4th and final conversion therapy experience. These requests were meant to encourage the patient's sexual desire towards this woman and women in general through extended physical contact under the influence of psychedelic materials. Eastern philosophies and traditions thus played a central role in ALPERT's psychedelic conversion therapy practice. But while this demonstrated a radical approach to healing from more clinical psychedelic therapies, we have to remember that his model remained deeply conservative in its intent. A second defining difference between many psychedelic conversion therapists hinged on their perspectives about psychoanalysis. While some therapists directly infuse psychoanalytic principles into their treatment philosophies and programs, others rejected psychoanalysis in favor of alternative methods and theories around the origins of same-gender attraction. ALPERT's 1969 conversion therapies were among those that explicitly adopted psychoanalytic frameworks, as evidenced by his statement that he worked within a Freudian model of the early development of sexual identity. Another example is a team of 4 researchers, A. Rollo, L. W. Krinsky, H. A. Abramson, and L. Goldfarb, studying multi-therapist interviews efficacy during LSD therapy at the South Oak Psychiatric Hospital in Amityville, New York. In a 1965 paper, Rollo's group describes the case of one male patient receiving treatment for depression, which they believed was connected to subconscious sexual desires for other men. The researchers referenced major aspects of psychoanalytic theory in explaining the origins of his same-gender attraction. Several LSD sessions revealed, in their view, the patient's failure to overcome the Oedipal conflict. This resulted in sexual aversion towards women. Their multi-therapist psychedelic sessions were thus focused on, quote, gradually reducing his abnormal feelings about the vagina and accepting the female genital in a much more normal fashion. There were also psychedelic conversion therapists who rejected psychoanalysis, but nonetheless agreed that homosexuality was a form of pathology. Czechoslovakian therapist Stanislav Grof's disillusionment with Freud began during the early years of his career working in Prague, where he realized that not only did psychoanalytic therapy require significant time and financial investment, but its results, in his view, were not exactly breathtaking. Watching patients undergo psychedelic experiences in Austria and later at the Johns Hopkins and the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center in Baltimore solidified his beliefs that Freud's theories could not accurately explain the results from or experience of psychedelic therapy. Grof instead took inspiration from Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, who he believed offered a broader, more individualized perspective, less reliant on deterministic erotic and sexual drives. Jung argued that a person's thoughts, feelings, actions, and neuroses were more broadly derived from their emotional investments, psychic energy, and/or spiritual influences. These perspectives coincided with Grof's emerging belief that birth traumas could result in certain neurotic patterns of behavior, including homosexuality. Grof understood male homosexuality as a pathology resulting from the death-rebirth struggle, as in the trauma of moving through the birth canal, whereas lesbianism was caused by the death-rebirth experience, as in the experience of birth itself. These nascent ideas informed Grof's LSD conversion therapies in Baltimore during the mid to late 1960s and early 1970s. The last major point of divergence between North American psychedelic conversion therapy practitioners rests in patient consent. It appears many post-war patients actively volunteered for therapies promising a cure for same-gender attraction. Richard Alpert's patient, for instance, is the one who initiated communication and explicitly asked for conversion therapy in his 1969 letter to Alpert. Patients at Hollywood Hospital similarly volunteered for psychedelic conversion therapy and even paid a substantial amount of money in exchange for this type of service. But we must also keep in mind that not all psychedelic conversion therapy subjects consented to practitioner attempts to eliminate same-gender desire. To name one example, Bertrand Tenenbaum, a medical doctor at Atascadero State Hospital in Central California, attempted to cure 10 male convicted sex offenders through group LSD therapy in 1961. He claimed that 2 of his homosexual patients temporarily relinquished the symptom after their psychedelic group therapy sessions. However, Tenenbaum administered psychedelics in a carceral setting, creating questions about the extent to which his patients actively consented to treatment. Other psychedelic practitioners drew voluntary patients, but ignored their specific therapeutic requests. For example, Canadian-born University of California behavioral psychologist Gary Fisher used psychoanalytic frameworks to treat a 20-year-old female graduate student for anxiety with psychedelics. The unnamed patient repeatedly insisted to Fisher that she was only interested in treating her anxiety, she did not want psychoanalysis, and she strongly felt that her same-gender attraction was not a problem in her life. Fisher disagreed. He contended that in early childhood, the patient adopted her strong, supposedly martyred mother's negative views of her father, seeing him as weak, incompetent, and incapable of financially supporting the household. Her unresolved psychological conflicts about her parents caused her same-gender sexual desires, which in turn supposedly caused her homosexuality. Her anxiety. Her psychedelic therapies with this patient thus focused on encouraging her to repair her relationship with her parents and eliminating her sexual desires for other women. American psychedelic research proponents Robert Masters and Jean Houston similarly described the case of S3, a same-gender attracted man in his 50s, as demonstrative of peyote's potential to cure sexual pathology in unsuspecting patients. According to their 1965 book, The Varieties of Psychedelic Experience, S3 took peyote with 2 other same-gender attracted men and a guide in a session intended as, quote, a kind of seminar to examine various aspects of homosexual psychology and problems of social adjustment particular to the invert. But S3 had a particularly intense reaction to the psychedelic. He experienced a profound change in his body image, which he believed was connected to same-gender attraction, since he felt both reduced homosexual desire and increased self-esteem in the weeks after the session. Masters and Houston write that this result was notable because of the patient's lack of interest in exploring or changing his sexual desires prior to therapy, as well as because of his rejection of further attempts to consolidate and expand upon the gains of this experience through explicit conversion therapies. One may only speculate as to what would have been possible in the case had the subject been strongly motivated to become heterosexual, they write, adding that S3's case was at least suggestive. This assertion reveals Masters and Houston's faith in psychedelics' potential to transform same-gender patients' sexual desires, regardless of patients' own hopes for their therapeutic outcomes. Now, despite the historical divergences outlined in this presentation, a couple of important aspects unite psychedelic conversion therapies in post-war North America. First, each instance fundamentally drew upon and bolstered negative mid-20th century social narratives about same-gender attracted people. As previously discussed, lavender scares in both the United States and Canada associated homosexuality with subterfuge, perversion, mental illness, and criminality. It's unsurprising then that psychedelic conversion therapists considered many same-gender attracted people to be mentally ill based on their desires alone. It is equally unsurprising that many voluntary psychedelic conversion therapy patients were drawn to such services in the first place because they already felt sick, broken, evil, or wrong due to their unwanted same-gender desires. But regardless of whether patients consented to or sought out these therapies, psychedelic conversion therapy practitioners weaponize patients' affective needs for love, safety, validation, and acceptance against them in this purportedly therapeutic context. There are various approaches, in other words, each affirmed that patients' sexual desires were undesirable and the result of an underlying pathological condition curable through psychedelic-assisted counseling. The last and perhaps most important point of commonality I'll note here is that it is impossible to make definitive statements on treatment outcomes for any of these cases based on the limited primary sources available. Archival silences litter the evidentiary record in the form of missing or absent documentation, limited published evidence, and a lack of recorded patient follow-up. Though some patients and researchers I've discussed claim that their therapy successfully resulted in lasting changes in patient sexual desires, we must take these findings with a grain of salt. Many of these practitioners did not engage in long-term follow-up with their patients, and the overwhelming scholarly evidence we now have regarding conversion therapies and efficacy casts doubt on reports of therapeutic success. We must also read such successful cases alongside those reporting that psychedelic conversion therapies were ineffective or even harmful for the patients involved. James Chaka's case is once again illustrative. By the end of his third treatment at Hollywood Hospital, James wrote that his LSD treatments had equipped him with insights to fight against his homosexuality. This feeling was short-lived. James initially reported to Hollywood that he found a girlfriend and was happy after his fourth and final treatment. However, a year later, James was receiving conventional psychotherapy at a different facility. His practitioner there wrote to Hollywood, explaining that James said that he was a homosexual and can get so anxious I just freeze. James was struggling with work and lived a socially isolated life outside of several short-term casual homosexual experiences in desperation to meet his affectional needs. It seems James's sexual desires continued to be a source of pain even after his psychedelic conversion therapy experiences, and this was likely true for many other patients who received similar therapies. Psychedelic conversion therapies began to fall by the wayside in the early 1970s. This is partly since the APA removed homosexuality as a distinct listed illness in the DSM in 1973, following sustained protests by radical psychiatrists and gay rights organizations. This change helped delegitimize conversion therapies by making it more difficult for medical practitioners to justify them in clinical settings. The decline of psychedelic conversion therapies also partly reflects how psychedelics gained increasingly negative connotations among North American public and medical professionals alike. By the mid-1960s, countercultural drug use, studies citing chromosomal damage, and deaths and murders attributed to psychedelics prompted some to see these drugs as dangerous symbols of cultural revolution, not compounds suitable for psychiatric interest. Sandoz Pharmaceuticals ceased LSD distribution in 1966 and recalled all previously allocated samples of the drug, facilitating a slow phasing out of North American psychedelics research into the early 1970s. But regardless, the history of psychedelic conversion therapies speaks to the urgent need to account for diverse experiences in understanding psychedelic research's past and present therapeutic goals and outcomes. Historical psychedelic conversion therapists were committed to the view that same-gender sexual desires were pathological and undesirable, despite their differing approaches. These were convictions that easily linked with popular mid-20th century fears of sexual chaos and communist subversion. The resulting psychedelic conversion therapies redefined these drugs' sexual connotations away from liberatory narratives of sexual revolution towards more conservative retrenchment of Cold War era anti-gay gender and sexual norms. The fact that mescaline, LSD, and other psychedelics have historically been recruited to enforce anti-gay social doctrines, therefore encourages us to think carefully about what's at stake if we approach these compounds without regard for queer perspectives, identities, and needs into the present day. All right, thank you so much.
So thank you so much for that powerful, informative, and stimulating talk, Andrea. It was eye-opening for me. What we are going to do now with the time that we have left is I'm going to pick Andrea's brain for a few minutes, ask her a few questions, and then I encourage everyone participating to either throw a question in the chat or raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask a question. But before that happens, Andrea, so I wanted to just go back to the beginning of the project, really, when this sort of first started for you. I wanted to know if there were any sort of specific documents or certain records that sort of shaped your interpretations, shaped your narratives, maybe got the ball rolling. Essentially, are there key materials that you wanted to flag up for us?
Yeah, for sure. So as you mentioned in your wonderful introduction, thank you again, I did my master's research on Hollywood Hospital, where James Chaka went for his psychedelic therapies. And when I was originally thinking about writing my MA on this project, I wasn't really thinking about psychedelic conversion therapy at all. I was actually interested in the role of the guides in psychedelic conversion, not conversion therapy, in psychedelic sessions more generally. And then I came across a patient who, in my thesis, I called Charles Stroud. It was just this little tiny record. There was only a handful of papers in his patient file. But as I was transcribing it, he described discovering his role in procreation through LSD at Hollywood Hospital and understanding what it meant to be attracted to the opposite gender as he was supposed to be, or along those lines. And that's when I realized that, oh, dang, psychedelic conversion therapy was happening at Hollywood Hospital. And that's what got me interested in the subject in the first place. So I think Charles Stroud's narratives and his writings and his patient file in the Hollywood Hospital records were really, really instrumental in developing this project in the first place. And after, in doing more of my research in the doctoral stage here, ALPERT's 1969 conversion therapy report was really interesting to me as well. I mean, Ram Dass was among the last people I would have expected to be conducting psychedelic conversion therapies. So that document got me really thinking more about the complex ways that psychedelic conversion therapy practitioners may have imagined themselves or imagined their role within the psychiatric discipline during this time period. Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder if you could explain for the audience here the nature of Hollywood Hospital. It's not in California, but maybe people don't know what it is.
No, for sure. Sorry. So Hollywood Hospital was a private for-profit treatment facility in New Westminster, British Columbia, which is right on the West Coast in Canada. It's kind of a suburb of Vancouver. It was known for its elite clientele, its very controversial treatments with LSD, with mescaline, for all sorts of things, mostly alcoholism, mostly drug addiction, but all kinds of other issues people came to this facility for as well, for interpersonal problems, for things we might understand today as mood disorders, so depression, anxiety, things like that. And as my 12 cases demonstrate, psychedelic conversion therapy. And fun fact, which I only found out recently, Hollywood Hospital was not named after Hollywood, California, but there was holly trees around where the hospital was originally built. So it was named for the shrubbery around that facility in those days.
I didn't know that. I didn't know it was named after shrubbery. The other question that I wanted to put to you about this fascinating work on conversion therapy is how it supplements or how it adds to other historical understandings of psychedelics in science, in medicine. So this area of conversion therapy, which is hotly contested, extremely thought-provoking, as you've already mentioned, how does it fit with other sub areas?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. So, I think a lot of time in the historiography, we see psychedelic practitioners as radicals within North American psychiatric practice. We often associate them with groups like radical psychiatrists, the anti psychiatry movement, or the psychedelic counterculture during the post war period in North America. However, I think that psychedelic conversion therapists really problematize this kind of thinking because even though these practitioners were indeed using more radical tools, techniques, and theories than their mainstream peers in some instances, they were doing so to solve a very conventional problem as understood within North American psychiatry. It might be more accurate to say that psychedelic conversion therapists were radically conservative in this moment. And I think it encourages us to rethink how we associate the relationships between psychedelic research at this moment of history with other parts of the American mental health landscape in the post-war period.
Yeah, one thing that struck me was that there was no uniformity with the therapy side. Was was
None at all.
was there uniformity with dosage forms as far as you can tell? Was there sort of a standard dose that people were using with conversion therapy?
I don't think so because they were using such different psychedelic compounds during this period. So Hollywood, for instance, and other places used LSD and mescaline, but as we can see, James Masters in Houston, they were using like peyote, which is a totally different psychedelic with different ways of ingestion and consumption and what have you, and a totally different historical context behind it. So there was very, very little conformity or cohesiveness, I guess, if we were to compare one for one what psychedelic therapies actually looked like as an experience.
Hmm. I guess that's fascinating. It leads me to, I guess, my final question for you is, can you reflect, and maybe this is unfair, but can you reflect on how some of these understandings around conversion therapy might be leveraged or might influence change in the present moment? I mean, what can we take away from this sort of historical analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that this history has huge implications when we talk about psychological risk in terms of modern psychedelic trials. So, psychological risk to LGBTQ participants in psychedelic research and experimentation in our modern day needs to be really carefully considered, especially given the historical context I've sort of outlined in this presentation here. I also think that it's important to think about the concerns we might have about clinical and non-clinical users attempting to use psychedelics in ways intentionally or unintentionally replicating these historically damaging applications and really harmful applications. So we've had in the last few years, I mean, the rise of really vitriolic anti-gay and anti-trans legislation and political rhetoric, whether we're talking about Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, Governor Greg Abbott's order to investigate parents of trans children for child abuse in Texas just recently as well. In Canada, like Conservative Party leader Aaron O'Toole was recently ousted from his leadership position, in part because of MP's lack of support for his support of Canada's recent conversion therapy bill. So I think we're at a moment where we need to think really carefully and to really approach these substances with care, because there is some concern about what kind of rhetoric and what kind of things we're talking about in the present day.
So I've got a ton more questions that I could ask, but I think that it's probably fair to turn it over to the audience, and I hope that other people out there have been stimulated by this the same way that I have. So you can either pop a question in the chat or raise your hand and unmute yourself. I already see one that's come into the chat. Andrea, do you want me to read this out, or do you want to read this out?
I can read it out. Thank you so much to Rebecca Winter for your awesome question here. I wonder if you could say a little more about the links to sexual orientation methodologies. I'm thinking in particular of so-called aversion therapy and these treatments being part of a landscape of ideas. Yes, absolutely. That is a fantastic question. So it's really interesting. It appears that some psychedelic practitioners in the UK, as well as in North America and elsewhere, were thinking about psychedelics as sort of a reverse of aversion therapy. So aversion therapy is basically when you introduce a negative stimuli to someone while thinking about and associating it with a certain pattern of behavior in order to discourage that pattern of behavior. So for example, in the case of conversion therapy, what that would look like is showing someone homoerotic imagery and then conducting then an electrical shock on their skin to negatively associate homoerotic imagery with pain, with suffering, with negative affection and feeling. So LSD, it gives people lots of sometimes negative, sometimes really positive endorphins, right? And so when we think about it in sort of conversation with aversion therapy, they were thinking about it in some senses as sort of the opposite of that, as associating heterosexuality, associating opposite gender, sex, and sexuality with pleasure, with good things, sort of the opposite end of that coin. I actually just read about a case in the United Kingdom. I'm still tracking down more information about that, where they were using chemical aversion therapies to induce nausea and what have you with a patient, and then following that up immediately with LSD therapy to associate heterosexual desire with pleasure and what have you. So thank you. That's an excellent question. And there's lots and lots and lots of really fruitful work to be done on that as well. Any other questions?
I have a question. That's all right.
Yes, yes.
So when we're looking kind of back, it looks like it wasn't that unusual to be that exploratory. Do you think that kind of research hurts that kind of exploration? Obviously not that extreme, but the use of psychedelics and those kinds of things today. Do you think that was the reason why it took so long to be revisited?
In terms of psychedelic conversion therapy, as part of the reason why it took so long for psychedelics to get a sort of renaissance in our modern context, is that what you're asking? Just to clarify.
Correct.
Okay. I don't know. I don't really think so, because there wasn't a lot of the broader rhetoric about psychedelics during this period wasn't so much directed towards its usages, but sort of, at least not for same gender attraction, but the ways it was associated with the countercultural movement in North America, the ways that it was associated with chromosomal damage. There are some really studies during that time period which have since been denounced but gained a lot of traction in psychedelic circles to really caution people away from psychedelics usage at this period. And there was also like deaths and murders attributed to psychedelics at this time as well. Some really attention-grabbing headlines that associated psychedelics with danger, with possible risks, especially to youth, to middle-class youth in particular. So I think that had more to do with why people were so reluctant to bring back psychedelics research. It had less to do with the connotations of psychedelic conversion therapy and more to do with the broader social narrative surrounding psychedelics at this point in time.
Great answer. Thank you. And
Thank you
thanks.
so much.
Thank you, Arsen. Well, I think what we'll do is thank you kindly, Andrea, for your time here. We do really appreciate it, sharing your work and ideas with us. I want to thanks also to our sponsors. That's the Holt Center. That's the UW Center for Psychedelic Studies, and as well the American Institute for the History of Pharmacy. I very much encourage you to poke around and explore these units, perhaps become a member if you're interested, if you support the missions, maybe even donate some change or become a member. I just remind you as well that we have other upcoming talks. The next is by Dr. Joanna Kempner from Rutgers University. and she's in the Department of Sociology, and the title of her talk is Standards Without Labs. So thank you again, Andrea. I very much appreciate all of you as well. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your days.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great Thursday.